Hi, it's Tania. In my previous endeavor, my focus was to encourage an interest in plants. And how I chose to do this was through the arts, through botanical art specifically. The motivation behind this endeavor was the issue of plant blindness. What is plant blindness, you ask? Plant blindness refers to the fact that people tend to be more interested in animals than they are in plants. The more formal definition is that the phrase plant blindness refers to one's inability to notice the plants in one's environment and therefore not recognize their value. Simply put, plants are background noise. Now, you might not think that improving public awareness about plants is important, but it is. And it's important because public indifference towards plants has serious consequences. The less people know about plants, the more this impacts our botanical capacity. Well, what is botanical capacity? Botanical capacity is our ability to manage issues in which plants play a key role. Think of everyday examples such as food security, sustainability, and of course, climate change. Okay, so why am I talking about plant blindness? I'm talking about the subject because I am excited to have as a guest today a plant blindness scholar. Kathryn Parsley is a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Memphis in Tennessee. Her research focuses on plant blindness and botanical literacy. She is doing amazing work and is in the process of creating tools that teachers can use in the future to assess botanical literacy in their students. Why did Kathryn choose plant blindness for her Ph.D. studies? What tool is she creating? Let's find out. So I love that you are here, and I love this topic because it is fascinating to me. People's reactions to plants and the fact that they don't have a reaction to plants. How did you come to study this topic?
So I was getting my master's degree at Texas State University with a plant conservation person. Her name was Paula Williamson. And she had a grant to look at kind of how students think about invasive species, in particular in Texas, because they're a really big problem in Texas. I mean, they're a big problem everywhere, but Texas is seeing way more than its fair share. So I was looking at that, and I was doing a literature review because I was in the middle of writing my thesis, and I stumbled across the paper that was written by Jim Wandersee and Beth Schuessler, that it was actually a Botanical Society of America bulletin. It was like one of their, it's not really an opinion piece, but it's just kind of an editorial type thing. And it kind of felt like something had fallen out of the sky onto me, because I realized that I had seen plant blindness throughout my entire academic career. And I didn't know there was a term for it. I didn't know that this was something that everybody experiences who is interested in plants. I didn't know that anytime I talked to a botanist about this and explain what plant blindness is, that they would automatically recognize that in some of their students and some of their experiences. And so, I found that paper, I read it, and then I kind of dove down the rabbit hole of plant blindness literature. And that was when I decided that I wanted to do a PhD, and I wanted to study plant blindness for that PhD. So that's kind of, it really was kind of a freak accident, if you think about it, because I was just looking through the literature and happened to stumble across something that I found really, really interesting. So yay, lit reviews.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And that's the bulletin, the little piece of where they coined the phrase plant blindness.
Yeah, where they actually invent that term, and they lay it out so beautifully, and they talk about plant mentors, and they talk about, early childhood memories, and they talk about how, the stage for plant blindness is kind of set whenever you're little to see, like, do you have some of these early experiences with plants? I reread that paper all the time because I'm constantly finding something in it that I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot that was in there. I need to talk about that some more. So
what did you want to study first? I mean, clearly it's plant blindness, but how did you want to approach this topic?
My first idea was I need to measure that. It was actually my instruments, which is probably not surprising. And also it's worth noting that the only thing that has stayed completely the same of all my ideas when I first came into this program are the instruments. All of my other ideas for how I wanted to look at plant blindness changed drastically, very much for the better. Very much, I feel like I went down a much better path than what I was originally planning to go down, which is part of being a brand new PhD student. But yeah, that was my first inclination was, okay, nobody has a good way to measure this. I really need to figure out how to measure this. And hopefully if I do, then that's going to be good for anybody who's interested in looking at this phenomenon. So.
And what were some of your other ideas then?
So I think most of them were actually things that had mostly already been looked at in the literature, but I kind of wanted to do sort of an experimental design where I wanted to compare students who just got like an in-class assignment, short assignment about plants versus students who had that plus maybe an outdoor program where we went to a garden or we went to a botanical area that's really popular. There's a Shelby Farms Park is really popular out here. There's lots of things to do out there, lots of beautiful trees. And so I thought, well, maybe if we combine an in-class assignment with an outdoor kind of intervention where we talk about plants and introduce these students to plants more, because obviously Memphis is a very urban area. And then I also wanted to look at, undergraduate research experiences and see if that was something that changed plant blindness. And those are all things that have actually been explored already in the literature. I really just wanted to kind of do a comparison to see like, okay, once and for all, is there some combination of these various interventions that is really, really effective at fixing, or not fixing, but at helping to alleviate plant blindness? And so I think ultimately I was just trying to figure out if it was like a dosage dependent thing, if it was the type of intervention, if it was how far apart you space those interventions. And so, yeah, and I think that I don't know that those were necessarily bad ideas, and certainly the feedback that I got early on were that it wasn't a bad idea. It just wasn't something that was particularly kind of new or something that wasn't particularly unexplored in the area, because plant blindness is a very small field and you do have a lot of opportunity with that to kind of, let's try it in this context. Let's experiment with new directions to try and push these things into. So
you are, as part of your research, are conducting interventions with a college class, right? And so this is a general biology class?
Yeah, the general biology class here at the University of Memphis, it's a non-majors course actually. And that's something that I'm interested in particular. I'm definitely interested in majors as well. And that's kind of where the idea that I had for the longitudinal study came into play. But I'm also kind of especially interested in non-majors because they're taking a non-majors biology course. This could easily be, as my advisor likes to say, the very last science course they ever take. And this is our last opportunity not only to get them to be scientifically literate, but also to get them to care about plants. And so it's kind of like, here's my Hail Mary, and I hope that these students will go out and understand how important plants are. Even though they're not biology students, even though they don't have a degree in that, it's still important for the general public to realize how important plants are and how we really need to take care of them. So,
and this is a large lecture course?
Yes, yeah.
And there is a lab associated with the course?
Yes, but we're not doing anything in the lab.
What does your intervention look like? How do you interact with the students?
I can't be too specific about that.
Okay.
But ultimately, we're basically just asking them to consider plants in the context of plant-related socioscientific issues. So we kind of give them some instruction and a little bit of information about, those plant-related SSIs like GMOs and biofuels and things like that, and see and, talk to the students one-on-one and see what their ideas are after they've had kind of that primer. Because the idea is students don't naturally recognize how important plants are in their life. If we give them like concrete examples of how important plants are in everyday life, maybe they'll start to recognize that. And so that's kind of, what we're trying to accomplish ultimately. So.
And how does your work with this non-majors class fit in with your plant blindness index and your inventory? I mean, it's part of it, but it feels like it's a little bit, I don't want to say to the side, but I mean, how does that fit into those other big tools that you're using?
So we do use those tools to, so the fact that the tools aren't finished means that we kind of take the results from those instruments with a little bit of a grain of salt, because they're not 100% validated yet, but they still give us really nice insights, especially at least question by question, as to how students are thinking about this when they come in versus when they leave versus in the middle, in general. And so we do use the Plant Blindness Index and the Botanical Literacy Inventory in our studies, if for no other reason than we want to see how students behave when they answer these questions. Is that going to change? Is it not going to change? It also gives us the opportunity to test, because after you do, one round of factor analysis, you tend to make tweaks to the instrument, and things change and evolve, and questions get added and taken away. And so it gives us the opportunity to test some different versions and look at those, and how if we're getting better or if it's getting worse. Hopefully it's not getting worse, and see how that's changing as well. So it does seem, I could definitely see how you might see it as a little bit disparate, but we do use those instruments just kind of to give us some context for what we're doing in general and what the students are thinking.
Yeah, because you have in your poster, I came across your posters in a newsletter for the National Association for Biology Teachers. Mm-hmm. And one poster was for analyzing plant and animal images in undergraduate biology textbooks. And the other one was about your two tools, your Plant Blindness Index and your Botanical Literacy Inventory. And you mentioned in this poster that the four components of plant blindness are knowledge, attitude, relative interest, and attention. Mm-hmm. Does one component dominate the others? Like, well, what am I going to say? Is attitude more of an issue, or is attention the bigger issue? Do they even notice plant?
So I think that's a really good question. And my first inclination is there isn't really one that dominates the other three. I think the one that is probably the most problematic of all of them is the knowledge one. It's not recognizing the importance of plants in your environment. That's the one that really leads to a lot of misconceptions, to a lot of very kind of naive and anthropocentric points of view. That to me is probably that problem is my least favorite problem about plant blindness. Also my favorite problem because I want to solve it, hopefully. But that seems to be the most urgent to me in terms of how that affects student learning, right? But then there's also attention, which is the one that is probably the most famous in terms of when people talk about plant blindness. The term itself is a metaphor for attention. And the attention one is kind of a unicorn amongst the four facets because it's biologically driven. It's a visual cognition problem. We tend to notice animals more than plants in our environment because animals are more likely to be food or more likely to make us food. And so, part of the noticing motion is, kind of an evolutionary thing. It's humans being humans. It's humans noticing things that are more outwardly similar to us. So that one to me is really interesting, and it's also really hard to get at because it's, like I said, it's a visual cognition problem. And so it's, in some ways, you don't want to fix it because you don't want people to be so distracted by the trees that are on their street that they accidentally don't look both ways before crossing said street. But you also don't want that attention problem to lead into the things like not recognizing the importance of plants. So I think those two are probably the most difficult ones to overcome in terms of their implications for students and student learning.
And what do you think would help increase knowledge and understanding of plants?
So I think really getting students' attention about the fact that here are all the ways that we depend on plants, right? Because students, they wear clothes and they eat food and they live in a house and they don't actually pay attention to the fact that those are all things that we've, used plants for. The fact that, I don't know, the vast majority of our medicines either come from plants or are chemical copies of plants or compounds that are found in plants. And so I think just in terms of the importance of plants, part of getting them to recognize that is getting them to notice the plants, which is an attention thing, but getting them to notice plants specifically in the context of their everyday life and their immediate environment. It's not just plants are outside, or plants are in a forest, or plants are in the rainforest, or something like that. It's plants are here and now and always, and you have to notice that in order to really recognize how dependent we are upon them.
Do you engage with the public at community events?
I'm starting to. I am collaborating to validate my instruments in high school and middle school students with the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center. I'm collaborating with them to work with high school and middle school students. And so that has given me kind of a door into a slightly different demographic than what I'm used to working with. I was very nervous about working with high school and middle school students because I'm not around teenagers I am around teenagers to some extent, but not teenagers that are that young and that early on in their career or their academic career. So the Danforth Center does amazing outreach projects, and they have tons of resources. And so that's really kind of allowed me to do some of that engagement, albeit not necessarily with the general public yet. I do want to validate these instruments, or at least the Plant Blindness Index. I want to get that validated in the general public as well, so you can use them in things like botanical gardens and science centers and nature centers and museums and things like that. So that's always been kind of like the end goal, or maybe not the end goal, but one of the hope for products of this research for me. Recently, I got accepted to be a Plantae Fellow, which is something that's run by the American Society of Plant Biologists. And Plantae Fellows contribute and curate content for plantae.org, which is basically a networking website for plant scientists. And so that's going to give me some really interesting networking opportunities with other plant scientists, but they also do some more outreach and public efforts as well with that website. They have a Twitter account, and they try to, feature plant scientists and why plant science is important to the public as well, especially to the public. And so that's kind of like a direction that I'm going in that I didn't originally intend to go in, but plant blindness lends itself really well to kind of a science communication angle, because no one's aware of plants and no one is aware of the fact that they are not aware of plants. And so the general public is definitely something that, like, I want plant blindness to be a household term at some point, right? Like, I want that to happen, and that's something that I'm very interested in trying to further. But I haven't so far had a lot of opportunities to interact with the general public in terms of just talking about these things, community events and things like that. Being at a university is a double-edged sword because I have a lot of great resources here, but I also, like, sometimes you get a little bit cut off from what's going on. But that's something that I do look for as much as I can. The other thing is I write a blog about plant blindness that I intend to be for a general audience and is intended to be a science communication effort as well. So, that's something that I'm just kind of starting to dip my toe into, but it's not something that I have a lot of practice with yet. So I'm being very, very cautious because I don't have any training in how to be a science communicator. And I'm still very new at in particular, that part of the job. And Jamie tells me, like, everybody was new at this at some point. Like, you just kind of have to figure it out. And I was like, yeah, like, I definitely want to figure it out. But it's also one of those things where I always feel like if I misrepresent plants, that I'm just going to ruin it for everybody. And then all the plant scientists are going to hate me. And I'm so worried about it. But
no, I don't think anyone's going to hate you.
I mean, that's the hope, right? Like, I want to make everyone aware of plants, but yeah, it's nerve-wracking. Like, I feel like there's a level of safety that you get when you're talking to other academics about these things.
Mm-hmm.
Academics who have backgrounds in science and you can easily converse with them about things like, climate change and fossil fuels and how those things are related. And so I feel like to some extent, yeah, like, part of being in academia and part of being at a university is that you're kind of insulated from a lot of the general public opinion. But as scary as it is, it's still super important to kind of try and push your way into that arena, because otherwise,
Mm-hmm.
we don't have any support for science and we don't have any support for research and things like that. So.
Okay, so one of your posters, presentations, was about plant and animal images in textbooks, in undergraduate biology textbooks specifically. And it's clear that you looked at for this particular project, introductory chapters and the chapters about the genetics unit and the evolution unit in these textbooks. And it was overwhelmingly clear that there are more animal imagery and that the focus is on animals more than plants in all of in these different parts of the textbook. If you could add key images about plants or key paragraphs or sections in all these different sections, what would you add if you had control over that?
Oh gosh. So I think I don't know. I think the undergrad that actually did the analysis might have a better idea of how to answer this question, honestly, because Christy did so much hard work on this. I think ultimately what I find to be the problem is that plants just aren't represented in the overall overarching concepts that are super important to biology in general. So, genetics and evolution, those contain very important ideas that are true across taxa, across as many different organisms as you can think of. I think that in particular, because of my background, I started off doing paleobotany research as an undergrad. And so I think that I would add like plant fossil pictures as well as diagrams of like how plants transition through evolution. Like we have some absolutely beautiful transition series of how plants have evolved early on. And just like, I mean, it's hard to get plant fossils, but we actually have some, really great ones. And so I think that I would try really hard to use plants as a primary example of those scientific concepts, of those biological concepts, of how natural selection works. Because, you hear topics in like ecology and evolution, and they very much all pertain to plants and just as much as they pertain to animals, but people tend to focus on animals more. And so I think that ultimately what I would want is to just say, okay, let's scale back the animals a little bit so that we can fit a lot more plant stuff in here and talk about how these are two big examples of how biology works. And then on top of that, I think that there are a lot of people who would be interested in incorporating even more taxa, things like protists and fungi and bacteria and stuff, because those also don't get a lot of attention. I think everything right now is really dominated by animals. And like I said, by charismatic megafauna in particular. So, let's get some ugly animals in there and let's get some fungus and some plants and some other organisms so that students can really see that these concepts hold true across taxa and across evolutionary lineages and things like that.
At the University of Memphis, is there still a botany class, a separate standalone botany class?
There is indeed, yes. There is a botany class. I am constantly and continuously depressed by the number of people who sign up for said botany class, though, because it always tends to be a very small class, but it is its own class. It has a lab component, which is really great. So yeah, we do have a separate botany class.
So, you mentioned that the enrollment is low for these botany classes. Let me tell you, when I went to my community college, this was in the 80s, okay? In the mid 80s, in my botany class, there were 2 people. And then that second person disappeared. And it was me and the botany student who was a Ph.D. student at the local university here, to where I live real close to now. Mm-hmm. And it was great. It was great. And they kept the class going, even though it was only me. When I was when I transferred out of there and in my biology of higher plants, biology of lower plants class, okay, there were 5 of us. And that's it. And that was way back then.
Yeah.
it was great.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of research that shows that, like this has been a problem for a really long time, don't get me wrong, but there's a lot of research that also shows that like botany classes and botany programs are just disappearing at an alarming rate. It's really, really hard to find a PhD specifically in botany anymore. And it's definitely a problem because we don't need less research about plants. We need more. Yeah. And the people who, might potentially go into plants as a research area, if they don't have access to those courses, they don't know for sure if that's something that interests them. So that's really problematic.
When do you finish your dissertation, your PhD studies?
Oh, that's the question you don't want to ask PhD students. No.
I know.
So right now I'm on track to finish May of 2021. So hopefully I'll be able to graduate next spring.
What do you envision after that? You mentioned earlier that you would like to continue your studies. Mm-hmm. What would you do if if you had control over everything? What position would you create for yourself?
So before I take a permanent position, I am interested in doing a postdoc or two, because my PhD is only going to be 4 years, and I was originally planning for it to be 5 years. But since I was able to get data and stuff relatively early on, I've been pretty lucky in that I get to graduate in 4. So I think I definitely am interested in doing a postdoc. There's a possibility that I might just stay in my advisor's lab because we're looking into getting some funding for me to stay here an extra year. We've got a lot of projects up in the air right now, so it would be nice to be able to wrap those up a little bit more before I go off to my next position. And there's a really great center, the Center for Biodiversity Research here at Memphis, that is really interested in my research, and they funded me to do a research trip before. And so there's a possibility for a lot of great collaborations there. And then I think ultimately, after I do my postdoc or two, theoretically speaking, I think I want to be a tenure track professor. And I hesitate to say that because they're so hard to come by. But I do kind of envision building my own lab and having my own grad students and having my own research program, particularly at a larger university where I have more resources in terms of grant writing abilities and hopefully more ability to attract postdocs and things like that. So that's kind of where I would like to go. Or the alternative to that I am, of course, also very interested in is working at like a botanical garden and doing an education and outreach situation at a place like that. Obviously, Danforth, that's part of why I was so attracted to Danforth, because they have a great education and outreach program. And, I would love to do maybe a postdoc there. I don't know. We'll see. But yeah, I was really impressed by their efforts, and I think that I could ultimately be really happy doing an education outreach program in a similar situation at a botanical garden or a nature center or something like that. So,
I'm hearing that you want to use your tools to teach other teachers, right?
Yeah.
So I assume that then your PhD will become a book, perhaps one day.
That's a tall order. I have thought about like maybe turning this research into a book. I won't lie, because I think that it lends itself, like I said, well to general public and science communication. And so, I like to read science communication type books and books written by scientists for the public. Usually I'm actually kind of interested in like physics books, Stephen Hawking's books and things like that. And so, yeah, I think at some point I would like to turn this into a book for the general public. My dissertation itself is going to be a book just because it has to be, like, it's just dissertation. And so I think that's that. And I've always been interested in writing a book. And of course, plant blindness is something that I'm very passionate about. So it would make sense. If that's what I want to do, though, I think I would have to wait until I got really established to make sure that I'm not like jumping the gun on something, because you don't want to start something like that too early in your career and then find out later that you kind of misrepresented something or whatever. It would take a lot of experience, I feel like, and it would be really time consuming and challenging. But I'm interested in doing something like that. And I really do, not just for teachers, but just for the general public too. And I think that I will always want to be able to help teachers, not just college professors, but also, K-12 teachers, pre-service teachers, especially those K-12 and pre-service teachers. They really have the potential to play a very big role in plant blindness and being a plant mentor to a kid in their class. Those experiences, as we've said before, are really important. And so I think that, yeah, I ultimately would like to keep doing that kind of work and hopefully try and be a resource to people who are interested in improving that in their own classroom.
As you know, my audience is comprised of freelance environmental educators, these independent professionals who work in natural resource fields and nature and culture, in nature and heritage interpretation. And they work in in their communities in all sorts of different ways.
Mhm.
I am sure they would love to learn from you.
That's good to hear. I mean, I obviously, of course, if anybody reaches out to you as part of this podcast, you have my contact information, and you're more than welcome to pass it along to them. I have had the opportunity to give some really fun talks in the past, and so I'm definitely interested, especially because freelance environmental educators are not necessarily as constrained by the academic model as those of us who are in academia still, and so they especially have the potential in their communities to do a lot of outreach and have a lot of impact on these efforts.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because interpretation is, that's their thing.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. You mentioned that how much you needed your tools to be validated. What does that process entail?
So that process entails a lot of frustration and challenges. No, it does, but it's actually also really fun. So it entails, so I send out my instruments first to the specific audience that I need to validate them in. So the first audience that I'm validating these instruments in is undergraduate biology students. These students can be non-majors or they can be majors. They can be in any class that is remotely related to biology in some way, but they have to be undergraduate students and they have to be enrolled in a class that's related to biology. And so right now I'm collecting data for that, and I've sent those instruments out to the Society for Advancement of Biology Education Research listserv and the National Association for Research and Science Teaching listserv, and I will continue to send out my instruments to those listservs to collect more data. So once you get the data collected, you have to clean it really thoroughly. So there'll be people who start to answer your survey and then stop, and so you have to get rid of their entry. Or there'll be people who, answer like answer to all the same questions. Like they'll always answer like strongly agree to everything, and then you get rid of those people too. And then you do what's called factor analysis, which is a really, really complex statistical analysis thing. And it's basically just a statistical way to determine whether or not you're actually measuring what you want to measure. Because with stuff like plant blindness, these are ideas that are in people's heads. You can't directly observe plant blindness happening in someone. You can observe behaviors associated with that, but you cannot look at somebody and be like, you're plant blind and here's how plant blind you are, right? So with these types of instruments that are measuring those ideas, you have to basically provide evidence that you are actually measuring plant blindness and not something related to plant blindness, like just attitudes about plants or just the level of interest that people have in plants. Those are all related and those are part of my instrument, but that's not all I'm trying to measure. So I want to make sure that I'm actually measuring the entirety of plant blindness and not just something related to it. And so once you get those results back, you figure out basically what items or what questions in your instrument are related to one another, and those come together into a group called a factor, and that's where those 7 factors came from on my poster. And then you do it again, and 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 you collect more data, and you continue to tweak the instrument based on the results you get. So if you have questions that are just completely unrelated to all the other questions in your instrument, you either need to edit that question or you need to kick out that question. Maybe you find a question that's working really well and you want to make a second question to help see if like that's more context or more information that you want to get. So the idea is that you get kind of feedback on how people are perceiving this instrument and how they're answering this instrument, and then you make edits to that, and then you collect more data and see if it's still being interpreted the same way, if it's still working the same way. And at a certain point, you'll start to get the same results again. And once you get the same results again, that's when you know this is stable and this is validated, and then you can publish it. So, and then everybody can use it for whatever they want to use it for.
Okay. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. Is there anything that you'd like listeners to know about plant blindness or plants?
I think it's really important to drive home the idea that, we can't survive without plants. I personally very much enjoy breathing and I very much enjoy existing on this planet. So I think just getting your community and getting your students and getting people around you, even if it's just like you're really stubborn aunt who doesn't like to garden or something. Just connecting with people and sharing the idea that plants are important, that we really, really need plants, that there is no us without them, and that, especially for these kind of socioscientific issues like GMOs and biofuels and climate change, they play a huge role. And it's not just like what they do for us, but also they have inherent value on their own. Like, they are organisms that were here long before us, and they have value in the same way that like animals have value as well. I think a lot of people look at plants in terms of what they do for us, which is great and is important, and it's really good to know. But I think that there can be pitfalls depending on how you look at it. If you don't value plants inherently, you may not value biodiversity inherently, and those are things that are really important, not just because of us, but because of it's been here for a long time, and we shouldn't be the reason that they disappear.
To learn more about Kathryn and her research, visit the show notes for this episode at talaterra.com. Thank you so much for joining us today. See you next week. Talaterra is a podcast for and about independent educators working in natural resource fields and environmental education. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with friends and colleagues. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Tania Marien.